Hello, everyone. I hope that you're all doing well wherever you are and whenever you are watching this video. This is part one in a new series that I am going to devote to the book Psychology as the Science of Human Being. The subtitle for this book is the Yokohama Manifesto. Why? Because the contributions or chapters in this book were all originally presentations at a conference in Yokohama, conference in theoretical psychology. It is the result of a very international collaboration. Just looking at the 5 editors of the book, we have Jaan Valsiner, Marsico, Chaudhary, Sato, Dazzani, and these editors are respectively from Denmark, Italy, India, Japan, and Brazil. So we are going to get a diverse set of perspectives, treatments of psychology. But what unites these perspectives is the stance that psychology is a science of human being as opposed to science of natural phenomena, science of inanimate objects, or science of non-human biological processes, or science of variables, or science of causal mechanisms. To say that psychology is a science of human being is a very critical stance against popular mainstream psychology. So the book is divided into 5 parts and 21 chapters. Let's look at the table of content together. I'll just read the name of each part. Part 1 is called The Knowing of Being Human. Part 2, Marking Signs, Creating Ourselves, the Realities of Imagination. I think there were 3 competing names for part 2 and they all got in different ways. Part 3 is Values and Ways of Human Being. Part 4, Human Being as a Generalizing Meaning Creator. And Part 5, Creating Future Horizons. I would like to devote one video to each of the chapters, beginning with chapter 1. So this video, the rest of this video is going to be discussion of Svend Brinkmann's chapter, which is the first chapter in this book, titled Psychology as a Normative Science. Brinkmann himself organizes the chapter around 2 fundamental claims and 3 conclusions that he derives from discussion of these 2 claims. So let's begin with what these 2 claims are. What are these 2 central claims? First claim is that psychological phenomena are being done by persons. This means that what interests psychologists, or what should interest psychologists, aren't things that simply happen out there in the world, but psychological phenomena are things that are being done. Somebody's doing them. An agent, a human person is doing them. So somebody falls down unintentionally, or somebody spills coffee on the floor. That's not immediately going to be interesting for psychologists. But if somebody intentionally spills coffee on the floor, or if somebody is intentionally walking towards a destination, that is psychologically relevant, interesting. It's a psychological phenomenon because somebody is doing it. To say that psychological phenomena are done by persons also implies that we should keep persons in mind. We shouldn't forget that psychology is about persons. A tendency that is very common in psychology is to get rid of persons and replacing persons with variables or with causal mechanisms that are subpersonal or non-personal. So for example, you might think, let's just think about a silly example like a relationship between self-esteem and socioeconomic status. Let's say that somebody argues that the variable self-esteem is positively correlated with socioeconomic status. That if one goes up, we can predict that the other also tends to go up. In such a statement, there is no trace of personhood. We are not talking about people. We are talking about variables. We are talking about variables that are presumably quantifiable, measurable, and by measuring the variables across a large number of people, we can, in a sense, get rid of the people involved. So Brinkmann says that we should keep in mind something like self-esteem is not something that is being done by people. Or if you want to talk about it psychologically, you have to talk about what is the activity that the person is doing relevant to something like self-esteem. The second central claim. So the First was that psychology is being done by persons, psychological phenomena. The second claim is that psychological life is lived and experienced within a space that is different from the space of cause and effect. So psychological phenomena is not only done by persons, but it is done within a space that is a space of reason, and it is conversational. So if you talk about somebody falling down unintentionally, that is kind of a physical process. It's not something, falling down is not something that I do. It is something that happens to us. So we can talk about falling down, the event of falling down, as something that has a cause. Maybe the floor was slippery, or the person was walking too fast, was rushing. And there's a cause and effect that can explain that. But to say that my walking to a lecture room is caused by something is incomplete. It doesn't make that walking, that activity, meaningful for us, because we have to talk about, in addition to causes, we have to talk about reasons. What is the reason that somebody is walking to a destination? What is the reason that I'm walking to a lecture room? So Brinkmann refers to that as the space of reason. Whatever happens in a space of reason as a psychological activity also is part of a conversation. It is part of an exchange between people. There's a similar distinction, if you're interested, proposed by the philosopher Daniel Dennett. Dennett talks about three different perspectives we can apply to the same process, to the same event. And Dennett's language distinguishes between the physical stance, the design stance, and intentional stance. And I think putting Dennett's distinctions, the three-part distinction, next to Wilfrid Sellars or Svend Brinkmann's distinction between the space of reason and the space of causation helps us realize that we are not talking about geographical space. We are not going somewhere else to talk about the space of reason. So a bad analogy would be that the space of reason and the space of causation are like marine biology and land biology, because in that case we are literally talking about different geographical locations. A better analogy would be to talk about spaces created by different disciplines or different ways of knowing a process. Certain phenomena, Brinkmann argues, that belong to the realm of causation that are also relevant in psychology. So when, for example, we talk about brain injury or nutritional deficiency or a viral infection with psychological consequence, we are talking about cause and effect. And that has a place in psychology, but that doesn't cover all of psychology. Other psychological phenomena belong to the realm of reason and conversation. They are part of a meaningful exchange between people. For example, Brinkmann talks about winking, the behavior of winking. To make sense of why someone winks, to make sense of knowing what it is, we have to know the conversation in which the winking takes place. What is the relationship between these two people? What is the purpose? What is the winking about? Is there an inside joke? Are they, for example, in a gathering of people and they want to secretly communicate something to each other? That's why they wink. Brinkmann then adds that most interesting psychological phenomena belong to both domains, both cause and effect and reasoning. They belong to the domain of doing and the domain of undergoing. And a perfect example here are the emotions. Let's take grief, which is something that Brinkmann talks about in this chapter. Grief is in part something that happens to us and in part something that we do. It is a response to a situation, event, or something that somebody does. It makes us feel grief, but it also has a rationale. When I feel sad, I don't feel sad because my sadness is caused and I cannot help it. But I can also say that my sadness has reason. There's a rationale. I can justify it. I can describe it in terms of a discourse, in terms of a conversation, in terms of not just cause and effect. That is why we can say things like, we can point to somebody who is grieving and say, he's overdoing it. This is a clue that we can say things like that. Or he's angry and he's expressing too much anger. This is not appropriate anymore. So we can say about somebody that her response is inappropriate. In grief, if somebody challenges us or presses us to express ourselves, why are you so sad? You don't just say, yeah, I'm just sad. You have the response, usually commonly we have the response that it is not just that I am sad in this situation, but that somebody in this situation should be sad. That sadness or anger or happiness, whatever the emotion is, when we are in that emotional situation, we can argue about it. We can say that this emotion, sadness, grief, anger, is what one ought to do in such a situation, that it is the correct response. There is, of course, a continuum of doing. When we say that grief is performed or anger is done by people, we are acknowledging at the same time that whatever we do is in a spectrum, along a spectrum that goes from deliberately doing something, reflectively doing something, to doing things unreflectively and almost without any control, without much control. In general, because psychological phenomena belong to a conversation that is not just within a person, is not inside a person, inside a person's mind or brain, you cannot describe a psychological event or a psychological phenomenon only in a physical language. Or as Brinkmann says, psychological phenomena escape physical description, and they escape description based on cause and effect and non-personal mechanisms. To really describe in a faithful and accurate way, to describe a psychological phenomena, we need multiple layers of description. And these layers of description must include references to aboutness or intentionality, what this behavior of, for example, winking or telling a joke, what is this about? What is this person trying to indicate? They should include references to meaning and normativity. Normativity has to do with standards of evaluation, to know what is typical, what is expected, what is a good instance of a concept. To say that somebody's telling a joke, you immediately expect the audience of the joke to laugh. So if I say, I heard a joke that wasn't very funny and nobody laughed at it, you will know immediately based on the normative associations with the concept that it was not a good joke. It was not a normal joke, at least. A related point here is that we should keep persons in mind. It is the person who acts. It is a person who gets worried. It is a person who gets consoled by friends, not their brains or their minds. We can, of course, criticize this claim. We can respond to it critically. We can say, why should we accept this apparent way of talking? Why can't we dig deeper? Why can't we come up with a scientific, more rigorous way of describing worry or action or being consoled in a way that is just using the language of neurophysiology, for example? So Brinkmann is saying that we ought to accept or at least take seriously the way we talk in everyday language, conventional everyday grammar. We should take it at face value. But of course we can ask why. To know why a little bit more, I think reading the chapter would be helpful. Now let's move to the three conclusions that Brinkmann ends the chapter with. Number one, causal language is inappropriate in psychology. Why? Why is it that causality, talking about cause and effect, is not enough in psychology? Because just cause and effect disregards persons, and it disregards meaning. It disregards the why and the reasons behind psychological phenomena. Second, normativity of psychology is itself embedded within culture and cultural practices. So to say, for example, that a joke should be funny comes from cultural practices. It is something that is itself, that expectation is embedded within a culture. Similarly, to say that a wink is appropriate in this situation and winking at someone in this situation is inappropriate, that is also itself embedded within cultural practices. And third, psychology is a normative science. In other words, the third conclusion is that psychology should concern itself with how things should be, how things should be done by people. Discriminate between good and bad, moral and immoral, ethical and unethical, and strive towards what is good, what is desirable. Okay, that's good for now. In the next video, I will move to the second chapter of the book, Thank you very much for your attention, and I will speak with you soon.